All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's installment of the Extending Empathy Project on the Road to Tulsa. This evening, we have Dr. Byron Craig and Dr. Stephen Rahko, who will be presenting tonight on Exorcising America's Demons, Race, Politics, and Empathy. And my name is Dr. Nathan Carpenter, and I will be providing technical assistance and direction tonight. I'll also be helping moderate towards the end of the talk as well. And for more information about the Extending Empathy Project, I turn it over now to Dr. Stephen Hunt.
Thanks, Dr. Carpenter. I am Steve Hunt. I'm the director of the School of Communication. And the School of Communication is extremely proud to co-sponsor the Extending Empathy Project with the Department of Psychology. We obviously owe a huge debt of gratitude as we've worked our way through a year of talks to Dr. Nathan Carpenter, who is the school's director of Convergent Media, but is all things technical support when it comes to making this process work well. So Dr. Carpenter, thank you very much for everything that you've done. To Dr. Byron Craig and Dr. Scott Jordan, we are exploring and working with the National American Democracy Project to take this to a national level, and that's something that we hope to accomplish next year. So thank you both for the work that you're doing here. Of course, our own Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Diane Zosky, has been an amazing supporter, and she's been a speaker, spoke last time in this series. Amazing support for the Extending Empathy Project. And then also to Dr. Felice Noodleman, who is the executive director of the American Democracy Project. She's been extremely helpful and very supportive of the work that we do, and we appreciate that very much. So with all of that said, it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Scott Jordan, who is the chair of the Department of Psychology, to give us a little intro for the speakers this evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunt. As he said, I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, chair of the Department of Psychology. And on behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of the Department of Psychology here at Illinois State University, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome all of you to the final in our series, the Extending Empathy Project on the Road to Tulsa. This project actually started in the fall of 2018 when I sent out a call to department faculty and graduate students, inviting them to participate in a project that would allow us to collectively project a more empathetic voice into our university environment and the community at large. As you can see, during that first year, we were able to provide 10 colloquia, and then the following year, we were able to provide 4 that had to be shortened due to the pandemic. Then early in the summer of that year, Drs. Byron Craig and Stephen Rahko gave an absolutely amazing talk as part of the series entitled, "What Should Empathy Be in This Moment of Historical Reckoning? Reconciling Black Trauma, Whiteness, and the Historical Structures of Racism Since 1619. This talk was a smashing success and inspired a conversation that is ongoing on the School of Communications Facebook page until today. Immediately following the talk, we knew we had to come together and create a colloquium series for this year, the Extending Empathy Project on the Road to Tulsa. Over the series of colloquia that have been given this year, we have talked about empathy in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of clinical settings, in terms of minority identity development, in terms of political conversations and political discourse, in terms of why it is that we don't listen to each other and how can we try to do that better, and then how it is that we extend empathy to people that have engaged in behaviors we may not particularly respect? And then how does a narrative help us develop empathy skills? Now, all talks in the extending empathy series have led to this one. If we're to move forward together as a culture, we need to create and live in an understanding of who we are that addresses the suffering, trauma, and struggles of all citizens. Tonight's talk is entitled Exorcising Americans' Demons, Race, Politics, and Empathy. It is being given by Drs. Byron Craig and Stephen Rahko. Dr. Byron Craig holds a PhD in Communication and Culture from Indiana University, Bloomington. He is currently an assistant professor at Illinois State University in the School of Communication and serves as an affiliate faculty for the African American Studies program. His current research includes the rhetorical analysis of anti-Blackness and anti-racism, democratic practice, trauma, and social injustice through sites of memory. In partnership with the American Democracy Project, Dr. Craig is excited to co-lead on a project that works on and researches through rhetoric and public culture scholarship how we might extend empathy and how we might do so in a way that can be constitutive and more robust of a participatory democracy that in turns open spaces for a more just and equitable public culture. Dr. Craig also serves as a content consultant and the writer for the President's Office, working with the Assistant of the President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Dr. Stephen Rahko holds a PhD in Communication and Culture from Indiana University, Bloomington, and is a lecturer in the Kelley School of Business at that same university. His expertise is at the intersection of democracy, corporate personhood, and the American rhetorical imagination. He also focuses on neoliberalism, rhetoric and social theory, visual rhetoric, rhetorical genealogy, post-race American foreign policy, and post-9/11 public culture. Drs. Craig and Rahko are also co-editors of an upcoming book entitled Rupturing Post-Racial Fantasies, the Rhetorical Politics of Race and American Popular Culture Since the Ferguson Uprisings. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my personal pleasure and professional honor to introduce Dr. Byron Craig and Dr. Stephen Rahko.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. Just before we get started, I want to say it's been a real pleasure working with these fellows all semester long and during this project. It's been a joy. It just felt kind of weird not introducing anyone tonight. So, but I'm happy you're all here and I'm happy to be here. So we'll get started. So again, the name of our project is Exorcising America's Demons, Race, Politics, and Empathy. And I'll just jump right in. So in 1912, Forsyth County forced its Black residents out and stayed nearly all white for 75 years. Shortly after the lynching of a Black man named Rob Edwards, more than 1,000 Black residents and landowners were forced out of the county. Forsyth remained all white for most of the 20th century. Today, only about 4 to 5% of the country's population is Black. The county's population is Black, excuse me. A headline in October 13, 1912 Atlanta Journal-Constitution declared, "Enraged white people are driving Blacks from the county." Additionally, the story says that recent outrages committed against white women in the county have so enraged the white people that many of them have determined to drive the Negroes, good, bad, and indifferent, from the country. The racial cleansing started in 1912, but made national news in 1987 when activists marched into Cumming, Georgia, to bring awareness of the county's racist history after Black folk were denied the right to buy property 70 plus years later. So as we, including myself, marched into Cumming, Georgia, we were met by white residents in the KKK with "Keep Forsyth White" signs, chanting the N-word, and rocks and bricks being thrown at us from the sidelines. And I was one of the people who got hit by one of those bricks. And I was with 2 of my brothers. So it was quite an experience. And that also happened on the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Let's see here. On hold on 1 second, sorry. I'm bad with the technology to get to the other thing. I'll let Steve get that for me. On September 16th, two officers, Betty Jo Shelby and Tyler Turnbull, were called to 36th Street North in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A couple callers said the driver's door of the SUV had been left open and it seemed the driver had just jumped out. As Shelby and Turnbull approached the vehicle, they found Terrence Crutcher on the side of the Lincoln Navigator. From the helicopter circling above came the words, "Time for a taser, I think." Turnbull and Shelby also heard from above, "That looks like a bad dude too. Could be on something." While Turnbull grabbed his taser, Shelby drew her gun. And we all know the rest is history here, right? She shot him and he was killed. After claiming Crutcher failed to act accordingly, Shelby felt her life was in danger and Crutcher was shot. Crutcher was shot and killed less than 3 miles from the community known as Black Wall Street. So this evening, as we complete the 3rd season of the Extending Empathy Talk series, we want to acknowledge all the moments of racial violence and tragedies that have taken place in America. Acts of racial violence that have caused the loss of countless Black lives in this country. A country that continues to have more and more acts of violence against non-white bodies that will probably still be commemorated 100 years from now. In this moment where the nation remains divided over the kind of change many of us want to see in America, especially, for example, in policing practices that would prohibit excessive policing, these types of commemorations like the one that we marked yesterday and today, we see increasing pressure to delegitimize the past atrocities that have been at the very root of America's existence. So we're living in an era where states are beginning to take legal action to ban what legislatures are calling the teaching of critical race theory, although they really have no real understanding of critical race theory. Briefly, CRT traces the history of racism in America through the lens of law as it intersects with the issue of race and to challenge mainstream liberal approaches to racial justice. This work comes from legal studies scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, Richard Delgado, Cheryl Harris, Charles Lawrence III, Mari Matsuda, and Patricia Williams. And America is doing a pretty good job ignoring and banning the ugly history of racism in the US. Or worse, we attempt to replace questions of justice through policy and reparation with, as Oklahoma Senator Langford would like to have it, the Sunday sit-down dinner. So as we bear witness to an America that hopes to hide its past, its history, we begin to understand how the Enlightenment might help us imagine what empathy in this time might look like as we commemorate practices of white supremacy and racial terrorism. As we continue to reflect on the murder and the legacy of George Floyd, it is our hope that you reflect on the ongoing tragedies and terrors that have occurred in Black lives historically. In America, there has been a complete disregard for Black bodies, a lack of value, but no amount of grace has been extended to us, where we have been enslaved, lynched, and murdered since the institution of slavery started. As English professor, I'm gonna try to do this myself. Go ahead, do it. As English professor and cultural theorist Christina Schaub argues in her book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, there is an ongoing problem of Black exclusion from social, political, and cultural belonging. Our objection from the realm of the human. And she continues, we can look to the current quotidian disasters in order to ask what, if anything, survives this insistent Black exclusion, this ontological negation, in order to observe and mediate our unsurvival in the United States. So for the remainder of our talk, we address the trauma associated with the burning of Greenwood, but also how events like Tulsa can be used to understand what we might say is a failing democracy or democratic experiment. So through this talk, we hope you ask it up by understanding how democracy fails because of ongoing racialized trauma. Is it even possible for empathy to function as something useful in our current public culture unless we really grapple with our ugly yet really, but our very real past of racial violence? So tonight we're going to introduce our work, our current work on trauma, discuss the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre and its significance for our current moment, and then outline what we shall call a democratic response to trauma and the need for patriotic empathy. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rahko for a few minutes. Oops. Sorry, we're in the same place for the first time, so we're having to move back and forth, so bear with us.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Craig, and thank you to everybody who's joining us this evening. So I'm going to begin by talking about where this project is and where it's going. So what we're presenting to you is sort of the rough outline of a book in progress that we're calling Democracy's Demons: Race, Memory, and Trauma. And what this book is seeking to do is contribute to both trauma studies, communication studies, and democratic theory by advancing what we're calling a rhetorical theory of trauma. So what I want to begin first by doing is kind of laying out what trauma is and where it comes from. It's sort of trauma studies as this interdisciplinary project that we're contributing to. So in general, by trauma, we mean psychic injury, but there is no current consensus kind of agreed upon definition of what trauma means. Trauma studies is currently an interdisciplinary project that encompasses a number of parts of the academy. It really has its origins in the psychological sciences, so namely psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and of course psychology. But also humanities scholarship from history or memory studies, from communication studies and cultural studies, even political theory, has begun to introduce and draw upon the heuristic of trauma as a way of trying to understand different kind of theoretical problems that kind of engage with the political, or that engage with how a culture deals with a history of violence and whatnot. All right, so, you know, psychological and psychoanalytic theories of trauma generally begin with the ego of the individual, right? How an individual goes through kind of traumatic episode and how this leaves a kind of legacy or scar on that individual, right? Something that I'm aware, I would assume many in the audience, especially from a psychological studies background, are going to be already aware. So just to kind of give you some ideas of some kind of ways in which trauma is understood from this direction. So Arnold Cooper, for instance, has stated, psychic trauma is any psychological event which abruptly overwhelms the ego's capacity to provide a minimal sense of safety and integrative enactness, resulting in overwhelming anxiety or helplessness or the threat of it, and producing an enduring change in the psychic organization. Likewise, Kathy Kruth, who's a literary scholar, but also advanced kind of psychoanalytic understanding of trauma, wrote in 1996 a response. She defined trauma as a response, sometimes delayed, to an overwhelming event or events, which takes the form of repeated, intrusive hallucinations, dreams, thoughts, or behaviors stemming from the event, along with numbing that may have begun during or after the experience, and possibly also increased arousal to an avoidance of stimuli recalling the event. So cultural and social and philosophical contributions to trauma studies really emphasize trauma not necessarily on an individual level, but more kind of a collective experience. There are traumatic events that occur, whether it's September 11th, for example, or whether it's slavery, or whether it's Pearl Harbor, or other kinds of like kind of national or even kind of specific kind of events that impact large collectives of people in different ways. Okay, so Ron Eierman, for instance, offers a nice kind of way of thinking about cultural trauma in this sense. He says, as opposed to psychological or physical trauma, which involves a wound and the experience of great emotional anguish by an individual, cultural trauma refers to a dramatic loss of identity and meaning, a tear in the social fabric affecting a group of people that has achieved some degree of cohesion. In this sense, the trauma need not necessarily be felt by everyone in the community or even experienced directly by all. While it may be necessary to establish some significant event as the cause, its traumatic meaning must be established and accepted. The process requires time as well as mediation and representation. And by mediation and representation, he's really referring to different kind of cultural sites, whether it's the cinema or popular culture or memorials or museums, by which the past is mediated into the present through an audience. Okay. And in recent work, namely by Sheldon George, who wrote a great book in 2016 called Race and Trauma, we've seen a combination of these two strands, right? So George offers a kind of like Lacanian view of race, which has its roots in, he offers a theory of blackness, a theory of racial trauma within the kind of specific African American experience that locates slavery as the source of it, right? And there's this kind of repetitive encounter with the past, right, that shapes an identity based in trauma, which is what he argues, right? Now, we, of course, are communication scholars, and we want to pay kind of a debt to those who've been looking at trauma in our own field as a way of springboarding into the way in which we're approaching this, because we are trying to advance a theory that looks at the intersection of all of these different strands in some way. It's more emphasizing the cultural than the psychological, but there are overlaps that I think that are important to understand. And so within communication studies, trauma has been looked at in a couple of important ways. So on the one hand, scholars like Ira Allen and Bradford Vivian have argued that what we do as a culture is we go through different rituals of witnessing. We witness traumatic events, right? So maybe we go to an art exhibit, or maybe we go to a public performance, and we recognize kind of a witnessing of the way in which kind of the legacy of trauma is provided and carried forward in the form of testimony of those who've experienced it, whether it's in the theater of war, survivors of war, survivors of state violence, these kinds of things. Likewise, other scholars in our field like Claire Siskus King and Susan Owen and Peter Arenhaus have documented the way in which trauma is experienced through popular culture, whether it's popular cinema or whether it's the way in which communities of trauma enact or reenact different experiences of trauma to make a point about it in the public. Okay? Likewise, Dana Cloud has offered some impressive analysis, not necessarily specifically of trauma, but she's argued that the problem with our current culture is that we respond to mass tragedies by individualizing it, by making them kind of a site of personal, psychological growth, as opposed to recognizing it as something collective that we have to kind of collectively engage with as a public, politically speaking, right? So in that sense, she argues that, therapy has become sort of a catch-all response to kind of, I guess, what we could call traumatic episodes that are experienced in public. And this serves as a kind of social control as well, right? So within trauma studies, there's a number of challenges within this interdisciplinary project that in some ways we're trying to respond to with our own work. So on the one hand, many scholars have argued that we're living in times of trauma. We're living in a kind of trauma culture where some experiences of trauma are eclipsing other kinds of experiences of trauma. Okay, so for instance, as some have argued, like Chanter, for instance, in 2018 argued that as a culture of the United States, we prioritize the trauma of the Holocaust and September 11th as opposed to other sources of trauma that aren't recognized nearly as much, for example. Likewise, the object of trauma, with the interdisciplinariness of this project across the academy, has made the object of trauma kind of less clear, right? So on the one hand, there's a distinction that's grown, some would argue, between the psychic communities that study trauma and the cultural communities that study trauma. Okay, and that this creates kind of a bifurcation within the academy. Another problem is to what extent trauma is unintelligible, right? Some advance this. A lot of scholars have argued across, trauma studies, whether it's literary studies or narrative studies, or even psychiatric studies, have argued that one of the problems with trauma is that it exceeds language, it exceeds narrative form, it exceeds kind of expressions in narrative form, it exceeds symbolization, okay? And it becomes difficult to document or even difficult to know how this works because it has a certain kind of intelligibility to it, right? And finally, some have even posed that trauma becomes conceptually fraught with becoming a kind of catch-all term that we resort to for trying to resolve unresolved theoretical disputes in different disciplines that are engaging in this interdisciplinary study, whether it's film studies or whatnot. And so these are some of the challenges that we see currently in trauma studies. And so what we'd like to advance, and we talked about this last year when we gave our talk, is a rhetorical theory of trauma that understands trauma as a shared symbol, affect, and experience in public life. Okay? And so, last year we introduced our rhetorical theory of trauma, and we used it as a way of trying to understand the protests from last year that really began to mushroom throughout the United States after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And so, you know, we understand trauma as an affect that is created vis-a-vis symbolic acts. And by this, we understand how trauma is symbolically performed and how it's rooted in collective symbols like Confederate monuments or lynchings, the Confederate flag, or other kinds of memorials to traumatic events in our history, specifically with regard to race, which is really what we're kind of focused on in this project. And we've argued that the lived experience of Black trauma is a product of a larger ambience of anti-Blackness that saturates our rhetorical culture through such things as media representations of Blackness in Hollywood cinema, reality television shows, with the narrow prisms through which people that, you know, embody a kind of Black experience can express themselves as cultural commodities of what Adorno and Horkheimer called the culture industries. And we live in a culture that memorializes the history of violence against Blackness, against the African American experience in the United States. Trauma is, of course, a matter of deeply personal and it's experienced on the level of the individual psyche. Right? But what we think a rhetorical perspective brings to our understanding of trauma is a deeper understanding of how trauma is an emotion or affect that is shared publicly in a political sense. The shared experience of trauma serves as a basis for forming public bonds with strangers who are symbolically marked as other, be it on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, disability, or otherwise. And for us, the seminal question becomes, for our theory, how does trauma go from personal to public? Right? The public nature of trauma, we argue, is critical because it's one of those problems that are in our politics where we have a tendency to, as Cloud and others have pointed out, individualize kind of traumatic episodes as something of a kind of personal, psychological, or you know, personal pursuit instead of a collective pursuit. Right? And we want to think about how trauma coalesces into something that is public, something that's shared, a part of a common experience, right? And again, this is what serves as the basis for our rhetorical theory of trauma. It's how symbols become the basis for generating or constituting or producing a kind of trauma that is shared, that's common, something that's public in nature. And it becomes a point of venture where people can come to identify with a shared experience, this public experience of trauma, and act on that experience, right? They act in public on that common experience of trauma. Okay, no differently than saying class politics or other forms of racial politics that we might see, or queer politics for that matter. And so what happens here is that, you know, as different communities of trauma can activate and act on that trauma to form counter publics, it's at this point then that legal challenges to the state, legislative change, or other kinds of resistance or transgression can occur that can constitute a shared public culture that can change that public culture. Okay? And for us, what becomes important is how shared trauma intersects with questions of violence and the history of violence. And of course, Dr. Craig's going to say more about the centennial of a traumatic episode that occurred in Tulsa 100 years ago. But for us, right, it's these common experiences of violence, common experience of dealing with the legacy of violence and the memory of violence and the ways in which we as a culture in the United States memorialize violence, whether it's in Confederate symbols or the way in which we negotiate the meaning of, say, the Confederate flag or other kinds of hate group symbols, right? That becomes a basis for this kind of tension. That becomes a basis for kind of an underlying thread or an underlying mood of our politics today that's sort of there, but not always stated. But of course, in the last 5 years, I think it's been more and more stated. It's been more and more at the foreground of how we do things instead of just sort of being like kind of enthematically in the background, for example. Right. And so, you know, aside from thinking about how trauma is a shared collective experience that can inform action in the world through counterpublics, for instance, through dissent and the like, it's also important for us to understand that it's negotiated politically in more ways than one. Okay, and by this we mean trauma serves as a kind of boundary of cultural politics that shapes types of claims that can be made on the state. Okay, and so one of the concepts that we're working through, we have been for the last year, is a concept that we think describes sort of the dark side of trauma. Whereas on the one hand, you can look at trauma. I think one way of thinking of this, we think of trauma as sort of a kinetic force, kind of kinetic socio-political force in our culture that is in many ways unstated, which we're going to talk about in just a second, right? But it's also symbolized, and it can be a basis for unifying people into counterpublics that can affect change. but it also is something that exists in the background that informs what we've called a hierarchy of suffering, right? It's a form, trauma informs a kind of politics where we negotiate whose suffering matters in a kind of hierarchical sense. And we create different distinctions in our culture about whose suffering is authentic, so to speak, or whose suffering is more or less tolerable than others. Okay, and so our rhetorical theory of trauma is trying to grapple with these two sides, these two kind of this dichotomy, if you will, this tension in trauma, this kind of kinetic, kind of even dialectic, if you will, between trauma. Where on the one hand, it can become a source of renewing our public culture to the extent that those who belong to communities of trauma can have their trauma recognized and that we can change our public culture and our collective life in that sense. But on the other hand, right, our rhetorical theory of trauma is also trying to reckon with this kind of hierarchy of suffering, so to speak, that is sort of there in our public culture and our public discourse. Okay, we have to recognize that, you know, all cultural groups that have a basis of commonality can make a claim to collective grief or trauma. We must understand how these claims to trauma are not neutral, right? There is this hierarchy of suffering, right? And this idea is something that we're kind of in conversation with Marita Sturpin's work, specifically her book, Tourists of History, where we have, and also the work of Kenneth Burke, where we have to recognize that, again, you know, we have this kind of differentiation of experiences of suffering, where on the one hand, some communities' suffering is tolerated and the suffering of other communities is not. So for us, a good example of this is contrasting, say, the response of the United States government to the opioid epidemic, comparing that with, say, the crack epidemic in African-American communities in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s, right? You know, the opioid epidemic is an epidemic that sort of affects all communities in the United States, but it came to be kind of understood as a white problem. It became to be associated with the deaths of despair thesis that we saw emerge this past decade as a way of recognizing and accounting for the lowering lifespans of white Americans over time. Right. So we see this as an interesting example. There's plenty of other examples that we could potentially get into, but this is something that kind of is sort of there always in public. When we compare the way in which the state, when the public kind of tolerates Black suffering in the form of, say, you know, the crack epidemic, as opposed to, say, you know, white suffering with the opioid epidemic. Right. So again, we can go on with some other examples, but this is sort of where we are with our rhetorical theory of trauma. And one of the things that we want to explore and expand upon this evening as part of this project is to recognize the relationship between trauma and our current crisis of democracy, which Dr. Craig had alerted to. And this is something that we see as an original contribution that we can make, is recognizing the way in which trauma studies needs to be in conversation with current scholarship on the crisis of democracy, because we see the two as linked. Right, so on this slide, you can see a number of popular books that have been published in the last 5 years. During the Trump administration, there was something of a cottage industry about the crisis of democracy that really kind of took hold in the public press, and that, you know, shot to the height of New York Times bestseller list or Amazon lists. And so, you know, there's a number of authors that have become more or less public intellectuals in the last 5 years because of their arguments that they've made during the last 5 years about the threats posed to our democracy by current political events. And so when you think about the different arguments that have been made by this collective scholarship over the last 5 years, there's a number of different theses that have been advanced to try to diagnose where our politics is, that we think trauma actually offers at least a contribution to our understanding of what causes these problems, or at the very least, trauma exacerbates these problems and it makes it worse. So some of the common threads that connect this scholarship on what the crisis of democracy is include, for instance, partisan polarization and cultural tribalism, a crisis of who belongs, or a kind of, you know, foreboding demographic anxiety that has infected our politics, where we're seeing whiteness as less proportional to kind of where it has been historically as a kind of declining population center within American politics. Economic inequality from neoliberal policies is often cited in this literature. Executive overreach and aggrandizement, or kind of the growth of the executive branch, in the United States has been commonly pointed to in this literature. The fact that we have a political culture saturated with fear and recurring forms of anger, and also the threat of normalized political violence, which is something we've seen, whether it's people kind of marching in public during the pandemic, demanding to not have mask mandates, coming to the public sphere with guns, the AK-47s, and of course the events of January 6th are a great example of the kind of threat of normalization of violence that we're seeing in this culture right now. We would argue again that trauma is underlying this, or at least making it worse, which means that trauma needs to be on the table for democratic theory right now as we're thinking about what the threats are to American democracy are, as well as threats to democracy around the world. And so when we think, for instance, of the relationship between trauma and partisan polarization, I think a good example of this comes by just simply looking at the Trump campaigns of 2016 and 2020, where, as we would argue, Trump went out of his way to stylize himself as a cultural gladiator, defending the suffering of a particular kind of white constituency that assumes that its suffering is not recognized enough by the state, right? Kind of captured in the phrase owning the libs, as probably heard before, right? So if you think back to the 2020 campaign, for instance, right, he went out of his way during the Republican National Convention to try to address voters in the white suburbs and voters in rural areas that, and to address them in a way to point out that their suffering is underappreciated by the media or norms of political correctness, right? And he went out of his way to be able to try to make the point that white suffering should be prioritized over the suffering of others, and that white suffering is really the result of immigration policies or the result of urban crime coming from Black and brown communities, or as he infamously put it, shithole countries, right? And we think that trauma and different constituencies that have a kind of a traumatic relationship, as they articulated, to the history, to the collective experience of the United States, really helps us understand the kind of racial divide and even the gender divide that constitutes the different coalitions that make up the Republican and Democratic parties. In many ways, you have, the Republican Party standing in for a kind of, as many have pointed out, kind of a white party, right? It's a party that makes at the forefront of its political agenda, white suffering or white aggrievement, as so many have put it. Likewise, when you look at the coalitions making up the Democratic Party, this is a party that represents claims to suffering from different communities, whether it's, the multiracial coalition that is formed through it, or kind of LGBTQ, the kind of history of trauma in that community as well. And so we think that trauma becomes a way of explaining partisan polarization in the United States to a good extent. Likewise, trauma is at the root of what some have called the crisis of belonging, right? This notion that, some suffering is more tolerable than others, or this notion that only some identities are recognized or should be recognized as, belonging to the nation in terms of cultural citizenship, right? So, during the Trump years, we saw this with the controversy at the border with children in cages, right? I mean, this was a kind of a touch point in our politics, where on the one hand you had some who were defending it as tolerable because these are illegal, these are people that are breaking the law, so to speak. On the other hand, you had people kind of calling out the kind of inhumanity of this kind of treatment of asylum seekers, for example. We saw this episodes of trauma along these lines during the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s, right? Where, communities of queerness were largely relegated to, the sidelines in our public culture. Of course, Reagan couldn't even utter the word AIDS for so long. And so, the idea here is we think that trauma and the experience of trauma and really becomes an important negotiating point between, as a public, how we negotiate who belongs and who doesn't, and whose suffering matters and whose suffering doesn't. Another good example would be the response to COVID-19. There was, of course, I believe it was Vanity Fair that released a leaked kind of communication from Jared Kushner when he was overseeing the COVID response from the Trump administration, where they basically said, well, we think that, COVID's more of a blue state problem, therefore we're not really going to do much. Or once we started to see that there was a racial divide in suffering from COVID, where we saw that Black and brown communities were suffering more disproportionately than white communities, that, you know, this then became tolerable in the United States. And we would argue that COVID-19 has been something of a slow motion genocide in the United States. And we think that trauma helps explain what is kind of at the rot of this crisis of belonging currently in the United States. Likewise, trauma helps us understand economic inequality, right? Dr. Craig's going to be talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 and kind of the overt destruction of property after slavery, not even to mention slavery, right? And so, you know, when we think about the history of racial violence, when we think about the trauma of the history of racialized violence in the United States and the way in which it has resulted in the destruction, first of all, turning people into property in the form of chattel slavery, right? But then also after the Civil War, the way in which we saw a racial wealth gap be created by, you know, events that destroyed Black property and capital accumulation, like in Tulsa, as well as other episodes that occurred during the Red Summer of 1919 and 1920, but then also redlining, also discrimination in access to housing or education or other kinds of skill development that's necessary for capital accumulation, and then generational wealth transfers as well, right? So trauma really is at the root of the crisis of inequality that we see, especially when we begin to look at the racialized forms of inequality, economically speaking, in the United States. And then finally, we think that trauma and the politics surrounding the hierarchy of suffering really becomes the basis by which demagogic rhetoric will divide the demos into categories of distinction between us and them, makers and takers, as Mitt Romney put it 10 years ago infamously, or friend-enemy distinctions, for instance, right? And once these distinctions are created, it becomes much easier for executive overreach and aggrandizement to occur, right? Because it lays the basis then for a demagogue to begin to consolidate power in the executive branch. Likewise, it also becomes the basis for normalized political violence and appeals to different publics on the basis of anger, on the basis of resentment, and also on the basis of fear, right? You should fear the other, right? Or you should be angry at the other. The other is responsible for your plight or your suffering, so to speak, right? And so we think that, you know, trauma helps us understand better a lot of the different arguments that have been made in this literature on the crisis of democracy over the past 5 years. But we think that trauma also helps us understand a deeper crisis of democracy, a deeper crisis that we could say perhaps gets to the legitimacy of the democratic experience and the democratic experiment itself. Okay, and so for us, getting back to that kind of unintelligible thesis, one of the problems with trauma as a political affect, as a kind of political mood, we would argue, is that trauma corrodes our faith in the democratic project itself. It's something that's absent but yet present, right? And it contributes to a deeper legitimacy crisis. And in this sense, we're really drawing on the work of post-structuralist French philosopher Jacques Derrida, and specifically his argument that democracy depends on what he called the structure of promise, right? And that structure of promise underlies what he called, which in French is la démocratie à venir, which is democracy to come. He understood democracy less as a kind of institutional arrangement as much as it's a promise that underlies institutional arrangements that can change over time, right? So what he argued is that we always want to critique democracy in the name of democracy, right? In order to get a better democracy to come. And the problem that we see in our current moment with trauma in the history of racialized violence in the United States is this, right? How much longer can we actually wait for democracy to come, right? To what extent do we have to perpetually defer democracy? And at what point do we give up on it? At what point do different communities of suffering, different communities of trauma give up on the democratic project itself, right? And that's what we see as the risk. And for that reason, we think that unreconciled racial violence and the trauma from that violence haunts democracy, which is why we're calling our book Democracy's Demons. There's a kind of demonic dark history that always kind of echoes through time. It haunts the democratic project. right? And democracies are particularly vulnerable to racialized violence, right? Because of the structure of promise. It's not to say that we don't have trauma in authoritarian regimes, of course we do, right? But democracies are particularly vulnerable to this, right? Because it relies on our collective associative living, and it relies on our ability to have faith in this promise of something better, this promise of equality, this promise of associative collective experience that we share with each other on an equal basis. Okay? And we also feel that the recent work of Akil Mbembe, right, in his book Necropolitics, which was published in 2019, also offers a nice way of understanding this. And to quote him, he says, "A pro-slavery democracy is therefore characterized by its bifurcation. Two orders coexist within it. A community of fellow creatures governed, at least in principle, by the law of equality, and a category of non-fellows, or even those without part, that is, also established by law. A priori, those without part have no right to have rights. They are governed by the law of inequality. This inequality in the law establishing it, and that as its base, is founded on the prejudice of race. The prejudice itself, as much as the law founding it, enabled a practically unbridgeable distance to be upheld between the community of fellow creatures and its others. Pro-slavery democracy, supposing it to be a community, could only be a community by separation." Right? And of course, we have to grapple with the fact that we are living in what was a purportedly pro-slavery democracy. And the legacy of that, we argue, continues to reverberate. Right? Likewise, we also find inspiration in the work of Judith Butler, political philosopher, who's done much to theorize not only the role of gender as a performance, but also in her recent years, violence. She's written a lot about violence in the war on terror. And she offers this remark, which we think also is very helpful in understanding what the problem is, what the relationship between trauma and democracy is. And she says this: "If violence is done against those who are unreal, then from the perspective of violence, it fails to injure or negate those lives, since those lives are already negated." Right? And so to the extent that we other the other, but to the extent that we tolerate the suffering of communities and don't grapple with the kind of collective trauma that is produced by that suffering, and if we let it linger, if we let it fester, right, then the democratic project itself comes under threat. And that's the risk here. And so I'm going to transition to Dr. Craig to talk about the Tulsa Race Massacre. But for us, the Tulsa Race Massacre, its significance is that it's an episode now 100 years old on this day that continues to reverberate. If you've been watching the news in the last 48 hours, you've seen how much of a kind of salient talking point this has become, right? It's become a springboard for not only calls for reparations, which we're going to talk about later on, but then also it's become a basis for then this kind of negation of those who, in the eyes of some, don't matter, whose suffering shouldn't be recognized. Okay, and so that's kind of where we are right now. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Craig to talk more about the Tulsa Race Massacre.
All right, so all right. So thank you, Dr. Rahko. So let's take it way back now. So we're going to go and we're going to talk about Tulsa some. A little bit about before Tulsa also. So the era known as Reconstruction that lasted from December 8th, 1863 through March 31st, 1877, following the American Civil War, marked a significant chapter in the history of civil rights in the United States. Following, the Reconstruction era, and after the turn of the century, now free Blacks settled in communities, and in some cases, those areas became quite prosperous. After the Civil War, with the protection of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, Black Americans enjoyed a period when they were allowed to vote, actively participate in the political process, acquire the land of former owners, and seek their own employment and use public accommodations. Well, as we know, opponents of this progress would often rally against this level of freedom for Black folks. Former slaves, began to find means for eroding these gains, or these folks begin to find means for eroding these gains in a number of ways, including acts of racial intimidation and violence. Still, we had the resolve to locate lands. They found the resolve to locate lands, and on this territory, they settled and created all Black towns and communities. But by the early part of the 1900s, nearly 50 plus of these communities existed, and Black people were beginning to finally make some wealth for themselves. As we continue to think about the intersection of democracy, trauma, and empathy, Greenwood Tulsa historian Hannibal Johnson asked, perhaps I think the perfect question, how best do we heal the open, festering wounds born of bias, bigotry, and racism, and burned into our collective consciousness by virtue of tragedies like the riot? Johnson offers thusly, one answer bandied about with considerable frequency and worthy of serious consideration is the provision of reparations for victims of America's egregious racial injustices. For over 100 years, the United States failed to recognize the ways white supremacy has impacted and continues to impact Black America financially, physically, culturally, and emotionally. Only recent, during the era of what many have labeled a moment of reckoning, have we started grappling with the unprecedented levels of generational trauma. Sites of racial violence, and many exist, of memory and trauma, or traumatic memory, continue to remind us of America's bloodstained past. So from May 30th to June 1st, 1991, in the following weeks, something gruesome and horrifying happened in this country. While it's possible you've heard this story because of all the attention it was received this last year, and leading up to this commemoration, like Dr. Rahko talked about the last 48 hours, I still want to offer a review of the events from the 2 days so you can imagine the horrors these families and others who lived through Red Summer, the period from late winter through early autumn of 1919, during which white supremacy and terrorism and mob violence took place in more than 36 cities across the US, as well as in one rural county of Arkansas, those people experienced. Hopefully you'll better understand why it is important to both acknowledge white supremacy and white mob violence as an important telling part of American history, and better understand the need to compensate the survivors and their surviving generations. So I pieced together some parts of news reporting and historical accounts and some journalistic accounts from its origins to the tragic white mob violence. So similar to many small Black towns across America, many Black Americans came to Oklahoma during the Native American removal. When these groups came to Oklahoma, these were called freedom colonies. The Greenwood community was one of the most prominent concentrations of African American businesses in the United States during the 20th century. African Americans traveled by wagons, horses, trains, and some even on foot to come to Oklahoma, as the state represented the hope of change and provided an opportunity for African Americans to not only leave the lands of slavery, but to also oppose the harsh realities of slavery from their previous homes. They began traveling to settle these homes or communities from 1889 through 1891 and continued in the years leading up to 1907, the year Oklahoma was admitted to the Union. Many Americans, including Black Americans, had moved to Oklahoma in hopes of gaining a shot at economic prosperity through mining and oil industries. African Americans constituted a small percentage of the overall percentage of folks in the state. However, the percentage of African Americans in Tulsa has significantly increased to around 12.3% during the oil boom. Many came from the deep South in Kansas because of the possibility of striking gold and because of the rich oil fields. But importantly, we have to remember that during the Jim Crow era, African Americans were not allowed to make purchases or services in predominantly white areas. Oklahoma was known to have some of the harshest and most unjust Jim Crow laws in the country. And because of this, Blacks invested in their own communities, effectively insulating cash flow within the Black community, allowing Greenwood to flourish and prosper. White residents of Tulsa refer to the area of the Frisco Railroad tracks in Tulsa as Little Africa or Nigger Town, names commonly used when referring to mostly Black areas in a number of towns throughout the United States. I even think the town that I grew up in, Sandusky, Ohio, had an area called Little Africa. That my brothers are on here, I think they can verify that for me. The success of the Black-owned businesses in Greenwood once led Booker T. Washington to visit the community in 1905. While there, he encouraged the residents and business owners to secure their ownership and claim their independence. Washington had secured a 4,000-acre, totally Black-owned district on the edge of Tuskegee in Alabama. C.W. Green modeled Washington's vision and organized the community of Greenwood a year after Washington's visit. And by 1912, it was home to about 10,000 Black residents. 100 years ago, the Greenwood community in Tulsa had beautiful homes and well-kept neighborhoods. It has been called one of the most beautiful Black communities in the Black towns that was settled in Oklahoma and included successful Black-owned businesses, banking institutions, hospitals, upscale hospitality industries such as restaurants and hotels. Its residents drove the latest models of automobiles, and the streets were lined with entertainment venues, boarding houses, and of course, houses of worship. The community's prosperity was how the area earned the name Black Wall Street. Greenwood was the home of Black doctors, clergy, lawyers, teachers, and entrepreneurs. Importantly, Greenwood ran north for over a mile from the Frisco Railroad yards and was one of the few streets that did not cross through both Black and white neighborhoods. Importantly, the residents of Greenwood took pride in this fact because it was something they owned and had all to themselves. They did not have to share with the white community of Tulsa. The many large stone and red brick buildings belonged to Black Americans, and their businesses thrived. Black American entrepreneur J.B. Stratford and his wife, Bertie Eleanor Wiley Stratford, arrived in Tulsa in 1899. Stratford believed, excuse me, that Black people had a better chance for economic progress as they pooled their resources, worked together, and supported each other's businesses. Stratford bought large tracts of real estate and subdivided and sold exclusively to other Black folk. Later, Stratford built the Stratford Hotel on Greenwood, where Black folk could enjoy the amenities of the downtown hotels where previously only whites were served. The Stratford Hotel was said to be the largest Black-owned hotel in the United States. Another prominent resident of the community was O.W. Gurley. Gurley owned a rooming house and built 3 two-story buildings and 5 residences and bought an 80-acre farm in Rogers County. It's reported that he founded what is now the Vernon AME Church. Gurley owned a great deal of the property in Greenwood and was even deputized by Tulsa law enforcement to police the Greenwood community. And if that's true, it didn't save him financially. At the time of the massacre, he owned more than 100 properties in Greenwood and was said to be worth between $500,000 to $1 million, which would be about $6.8 to $13.6 million in 2021. Dr. Tiffany Critcher argues, and this is Terrence Critcher's twin sister, who was killed by the police I talked about earlier. Stanford could have been the Marriott of the Hiltons of today, and Gurley may have been one of the great entrepreneurs in Tulsa in the United States. Additionally, there is no way of knowing just how successful the businesses in Greenwood could have been and how much generational wealth they could have generated. Both men left Greenwood, and both were never as successful as they were in Greenwood. So, what happened in Greenwood? We are told the trouble started after a white elevator operator named Sarah Page, who was 17 years old, screamed as she was riding in the elevator with a young Black man who shined shoes named Dick Rowland. He was 19 at the time. He was working in downtown Tulsa. Rowland had to use the bathroom in the Drexel House, housed the only bathroom African Americans could use at the time in the Tulsa downtown area. To this day, it is not clear what happened, and in the elevator, but the police and the newspaper reported that the white woman had been assaulted by Rowland. Indeed, the Tulsa Tribune headline on May 31st read, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator." The Tribune reported that Rowland attacked her, scratching her hands and face and tearing her clothes. The charges were never substantiated, by the way, and the charges against Rowland were eventually dropped. Descendants of Rowland say he and Page had been romantically involved. This was the start of the massacre that took place in Tulsa. Once the press released their story, an angry mob of nearly 300 white men descended on the courthouse and demanded Rowland be released into their custody, where they would take the law into their own hands. A number of Black men, mostly veterans, showed up as well to provide protection for Rowland. As the story goes, one member of the white mob attempted to begin shooting, and a Black resident fought with him over the gun. A gunshot went off, and this would be the start of an evening of white mob terrorism. Later in the evening, the white mob, over 1,000, became more enraged and marched into the Greenwood community and began the terror. But what was the real origin of the white mob violence in Greenwood? Like other predominantly Black areas across the United States, communities like Greenwood and its Black wealth posed a serious threat to white economic and political power, as historian Hannibal Johnson argues. While we grapple with this act of white mob violence, we have to make it clear that sometimes it is just what it sounds like: racism, the white supremacy. From Page claiming she was attacked by Rowland to the destruction of Black lives and Black wealth starting in 1919, it has always been about white supremacists' need to ensure Black wealth and full participation in American democracy and industry never meets its full potential. And this is true of whites in Tulsa. White residents felt intimidated by the prosperity, growth, and size of Black Wall Street. Not only was Greenwood, Tulsa expanding in population, but it was also expanding its physical boundaries, which eventually collided with the boundaries of the white neighborhoods in Tulsa. According to some newspapers at the time, there were reports of hateful letters sent to prominent business leaders within Black Wall Street, which demanded that they stop overstepping their boundaries. As expected, white residents grew increasingly resentful about the wealth of the Greenwood community, and alongside of this, there's the very real possibility Tulsa's white residents were merely, guess it, just racist. That racism, that white supremacist ideology made a community disappear, and with it, generations of possible wealth and health. Yeah, 1 second. As we get to them. I missed some slides, so I'm going to skip over these. Okay. So I want to show a clip from the show Watchmen from 2019. And some of you may have seen this, but what I want to do is to show the beginning of this clip, because this is a moment where most people became familiar with Tulsa. And it also was a moment that a lot of people seem to get upset about, the rewriting of the Watchmen show, right? And a lot of people were like, did this thing really happen? So this was a moment that really shocked a lot of people. So I'm going to show, yeah, can everyone see this? Okay.
Justice today. Trust in the law.
sake of time, I'm going to stop this here. So from their April 2021 report, the Smithsonian Magazine tells us that at 5:08 a.m. on June 1st, 1921, a whistle pierced the pre-dawn quiet of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was the signal for as many as 10,000 armed white Tulsans, some dressed in Army uniforms from their service in World War I, to attack the place known as Greenwood, the city's very prosperous African-American community. Accordingly, they state that, quote, from every place of shelter up and down the tracks came screaming, shouting men to join in the rush toward the Negro section. A white witness named Chop Phillips later remembered by dawn, they conclude machine guns were sweeping the valley with their murderous fire, recalled a Greenwood resident named Dimple Bush. Old women and men and children were running and screaming everywhere. Eyewitness and writer Mary Jones Parrish recalls her own story in the following way. She grabbed her young daughter's hands and ran for her life. Dodging machine gun fire, they sprinted down Greenwood Avenue, a street so prosperous it would later be remembered as Black Wall Street. Above them, the sky buzzed with several civilian airplanes dropping makeshift turpentine bombs. Thousands of Black people fled while the mob advanced, looting, torching houses, churches, and other buildings, and shooting Black people in cold blood. Get out of the street with that child or you'll both be killed, someone yelled. But Parrish was found nowhere to hide. She felt it would be suicide to remain in her apartment. For it would surely be destroyed, and the death in the street was preferred. For we expected to be shot down at any moment, she recalled in her 1922 book, which includes rare witness accounts of what has become known as the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. For 2 days, Black Americans in the Tulsa community of Greenwood were terrorized and their property was destroyed in just 18 hours. The property they worked so hard to create was burned down to ashes. Black men, women, and children were shot down in the streets and inside their homes, while others perished inside their homes, being afraid to leave for fear of being shot by the mobs of angry white men and women. Perhaps even more is equally disturbing, aircrafts were used to drop firebombs on the homes and businesses in Greenwood. Many of the witnesses reported days after seeing the lifeless bodies lying in the streets of the once prosperous Black communities. Others reported seeing Black bodies being thrown into the river after being murdered by these white mobs, while others recall seeing bodies thrown into a mass grave. All in all, so far the reports stand at 300 lives being taken during the Tulsa Race Massacre. But some reports suggest beyond that 300, at least 1,000 were missing. But the horror didn't end there. After the 2 days, Black Americans in Tulsa were placed in internment camps. And I know we typically believe that we talk about the internment camps after December 7th, 1941, after Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066, and the Navy removed Japanese Americans or Japanese descendants from cities and put them in the internment camps. But the governor of Oklahoma called in out-of-town National Guard units to keep the peace. The local units in Tulsa had joined the mob's destruction, and rather than protecting Greenwood residents, they detained them in internment camps at the city's convention hall, baseball park, and fairgrounds. For weeks after the massacre, Black Americans were kept in these camps. At least 10,000 Black folks were left homeless. Officials claim they were put in the camps in order to protect them. While most of us know Japanese Americans were placed in these camps, little time has been spent thinking about the camps the residents of what was Black Wall Street were forced to live in after Greenwood was burned down. What we do know is that Black Tulsans were only allowed to leave the internment camps after having a green card signed by a white person who could vouch for them, usually someone who had employed them. So we can argue, therefore, that Blackness symbolically serves as a permission structure for enacting the state of exception. we see the emergence of internment camps after slavery. What we see is that where property was destroyed, Blackness served as a permission for state exception and carved out anti-democratic spaces. Tulsa represents the abandonment of any real owned Black ownership that is never recovered or compensated for. So we're getting kind of close now. We want to make sure we have questions and we have time for Q&A. So I'm actually going to turn it back over to Steve. I was going to talk a little bit about the hearings, but we can come back to that if we have questions about it. And I'm talking about the hearings from May 19th, where the 3 survivors of Tulsa offered testimony about the events and what happened to them, but also what happened to their lives after Tulsa, and the way they have struggled since Tulsa. But it's also important to think about, before I turn over to Steve, how this still resonates. And you just put up a map here that shows some of the other areas where there were Black massacres. And we can see, that this goes as late as Charleston in 2015, which we're still going to call a massacre of Black folk. And so what we want to think about is that we need to continue to grapple with this type of trauma. And we hope that our scholarship looks at this, but I'm going to let Steve finish up so we can have some time for Q&A.
All right, thank you, Dr. Craig. So by way of conclusion, I want to come back to the question of trauma, because for us, the crisis of democracy and the crisis that trauma poses to democracy poses a question that we want to put on the table. And that is this, right? On the centennial anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, we ask, what does it mean to have a democratic response to cultural trauma? We think this is an important question to pose because, as Ron Eierman and others have noted, we have a tendency to individualize responsibility rather than recognizing collective responsibility for acts of trauma. Okay, and so the problem is that we want to be able to distinguish between a democratic response to trauma, right, a response that actually renews our democracy, that actually offers an opportunity for making it better, for making it whole, as opposed to what we would call weak responses, which maybe give lip service to these historically traumatic and violent episodes, but that aren't actually any kind of means towards reconciliation about them. Okay. And so when we think about a democratic response to trauma, a concept that comes to mind that we found researching for this project so far is a concept that was that's been advanced, I should say, by John R. Wood, called patriotic empathy. And this is where we think empathy becomes an important concept to begin to build towards a democratic response to trauma. Right? And by patriotic empathy, Wood wants to draw attention to what he calls a kind of a new moral language for being able to reinvigorate collective virtue, right? Virtue was a really important concept at the founding period, that's informed by Republican ideas of government. But it's really kind of been lost as liberalism emerges and kind of sweeps away this different kind of Republican ideology, kind of lower R, small r Republican ideology, right? And Wood argues that we need a kind of patriotic empathy in order to develop a civic renaissance. And we see it maybe perhaps a good example of this in the form of the Poor People's Campaign, right? A grassroots movement to try to build a kind of politics across different sites of trauma that's racially experienced, right? On the basis of poverty, as opposed to just sort of, racialized suffering, for instance, right? So what we need is kind of a collective language that's going to be able to rename us as a people, kind of offer a kind of a new kind of e publis urnum for this era of hyperpolarization. So that's one possible way of thinking about this. Another possible way we think is advanced by the work of Bryan Stevenson, right? When he basically argues that, in order to be a citizen, we have to take the good with the bad from the United States. We can't just sort of self-select the things that we want to admire or be proud of with our heritage without actually claiming the darker side of our history, which is why, again, as Dr. Craig was pointing out, the controversy over critical race theory, or the way in which we're seeing the banning of teaching this, or the rise of different constituencies, namely white constituencies, claiming that they should be free from uncomfortable teaching in the classroom with regard to questions of race, or the kind of regrettable history of violence as represented in, say, the Tulsa Race Massacre 100 years ago. We also think that a democratic response has to include questions of reparations. We have to recognize that, this has to be involving not only people who directly benefited from redlining, directly benefited from Jim Crow, directly benefited from slavery. I mean, we can trace all the different perpetrators of the Tulsa Race Massacre and all the other kinds of massacres that occurred during the Red Summer, for instance, or during the kind of the post immediate Gilded Age period of time when Black wealth and the wealth of other kind of non-white peoples was basically stunted. Right, so HR 40 is one possible route here. HR 40 just went out of the Judiciary Committee, and so it's going to go to the House of Representatives for a vote. This would establish a commission to be able to study this. Right, we have to begin to kind of account for this before we can even begin to grapple with what kinds of just reparations might be done. But nonetheless, even for those who aren't direct ascendants of profiting from episodes like the Tulsa Race Massacre or slavery, I think we have to recognize that white Americans are at the very least secondary, even tertiary beneficiaries of structural racism, even if they didn't own slaves, or even if they didn't take property directly from massacres like we saw in Tulsa, right? White Americans have been secondary, tertiary beneficiaries of redlining, of discrimination in housing and in access to education. Think about the GI Bill, for instance. Remember last year when we gave this talk, Dr. Craig and I talked about our own respective histories, whereas his family history was marked by a loss of property, wealth, which then caused a migration north. My family never had that problem. Right? My family actually benefited directly from the GI Bill. We can draw a direct lineage from the GI Bill to then my own kind of livelihood today. So we think that the democratic response to trauma also has to involve the question of reparations. Likewise, a democratic response to trauma could also involve what's been called baby bond proposal by William Garrity and Derek Hamilton, which is basically about creating trust funds that are proportional to the family's wealth status, right? So as they put it, if Bill Gates has a new child, we give him $50 trust fund. For those families or those children that are born to families at the lower end of the wealth scale, right, we would give them a larger trust fund. Okay, so this would be a way of kind of providing universal responses to collective trauma, but that really do kind of disproportionately target those who've been the victims disproportionately of trauma as well, right? So, or as they put it, right, it would be universal Americans, but it would not be uninformed by the history of racial trauma and violence. Likewise, we actually had a chapter that was published in a book yesterday called The Gig Economy, Workers and Media and Age Convergence, where we argue for a data commons, right? So another way of responding democratically to this trauma is to actually begin to find ways of democratizing sources of wealth like data, for instance, that can be collectively shared and that can potentially be a basis for, starting up, creating more opportunities for wealth generation for those who've been the victims of these kinds of historic ills. Right, by making data, proprietary data that's collected by big tech companies more readily available for startups in the Black community, for instance, or in other kinds of communities of trauma. And then finally, for us, we're in an unprecedented historical era because over the next several decades, we're going to see an enormous wealth transfer, upwards of 60 to even $70 trillion, as wealth is transferred from the baby boomer generation to their children. And so there's different estimates about how much this is going to be. It ranges from 60 to $70 trillion, but this wealth transfer becomes a unique opportunity for us as a collective people to begin to find the resources, to find the wealth for financing new collective programs that we kind of universally apply, whether it's healthcare, whether it's a data commons, but then also this is the source that could also be the basis for financing reparations or financing other kinds of collective measures that can target the racial divide and communities of trauma from racial violence in the United States, but also affect everybody in a way that kind of lowers the wealth gap, and that lowers the inequality gap collectively for all Americans. So we thank you for joining us this evening. We look forward to your questions.
Yep. Thank you, Drs. Craig and Dr. Rahko. So at this time, I'm going to help moderate comments, and we'll do these in 3 different ways. So first, if you are joining us on Zoom, if you do have a direct question, and if you feel comfortable asking that, feel free to use the raise your hand function, and I may actually try to look around the room and see if you have a physical hand raised as well. If you are not comfortable doing that, feel free to pose your questions directly in the chat section of Zoom, and I will go ahead and relay them to our presenters. And finally, if you're joining us on YouTube, feel free to use the reply or the chat function there on the YouTube stream, and I will also relay that to our presenters. Do keep in mind that there is a 5 to 10 second delay, so we may not hear it immediately. All right, are there any questions? All right, I see Adam has his hand raised.
This is actually Andrea.
Oh, it is. I'm sorry, Andrea.
No, you're good. And if you hear my children's toys, sorry, they all start singing at the same time, and I just stepped on one.
It's okay. You're in 10 forward, so life is good.
Yeah. So my question is going back to the they're so loud. Sorry. The push against critical race theory being taught and having these discussions. And so one way to really get people to understand and build that empathy piece is so they understand the stories, they understand the history, but now we're being pushed to not include those things. So for those of us who want to help, what would be your suggestion, or what would be your recommendations for how we can save critical race theory?
Well, first I would say that I don't know. I don't think they even know what they're talking about when they talk about critical race theory, right? with this being the intersection with legal studies, right, and liberalism. But my real fear of this is that they want to take out that history. I think what they really want to do is take out this history of what happened to Black Americans, right? The violence that happened towards Black Americans. And I think that's going to this is going to take, I think, one of these responses that Dr. Rahko was just talking about, thinking about, I think the education department has to get involved in this, and thinking about, this kind of controlling over our teachers and what they're teaching. And, it's not like this is a new battle. The school teachers have had this struggle for years. I have friends who are teachers who have had to fight the battle of what books that their students could read in the classroom, right? And I don't think that just comes from, from senators and governors and things. I think there are parents in these communities who don't want these types of things taught either, right? I mean, because let's face it, we just came out of 4 years of, of empowerment of that voice of, not wanting to acknowledge the bad history, which I would say is the complete history of this country. So, thinking about, how you empower that, I think it has to be through policy as well. I think it has to be a fight against, these governors and senators who are making this push. And we have to, I think it's going to have to be, something that's going to have to be policy push. I don't know, Dr. Rahko.
I mean, I agree. I think I think if they're trying to avoid talking about this, then you may want to ask why, right? And I think that it's, I guess the question is, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of the inquiry, right? And for all of this talk about teaching being an absence of, we hear a lot of complaining about the loss of free and the like, right? And I think that to me, this is just sort of brings a lie to this. It's hypocritical for one, but again, I think that one way to kind of, I guess, to push back is, create your own content on YouTube, right? Create your own public pedagogies and create, content that is providing the corrective to the problem that you're seeing with regard to this. In many ways, YouTube is, I think I always ask my students, when you're thinking about in the business school course that I teach, when we're thinking about PR, I always ask my students, so when you watch your siblings, are they more likely to watch television or YouTube? And they're always going to be watching YouTube, right? So YouTube is kind of where the fight of the future is. And which makes for us, for our work on data, the algorithm has to be kind of the site of our thinking as well. And it's become, more and more in line with, the controversies involving Facebook, and not just deplatforming, but also the way in which these algorithms are generating content to people that kind of builds, radical kind of white supremacist movements, not just white supremacists, but also, kind of misogynistic movements, homophobic movements, under other names, other kind of, whether it's religious causes or otherwise, right? So that's another way in which you can push back as well. Obviously, kind of, entering the public sphere and demanding that, we actually have an authentic kind of reckoning with our own history, but then also creating our content. So.
Thank you.
And we have a comment from YouTube tonight. This comes from Jennifer, who asks, or actually first has a comment just saying that the examples of democratic responses to trauma come from multiple areas, government policy, economic, grassroots activism, etc., and says that these are great. Then she also asks, what challenges do you see, or what challenges do you foresee to adopting this attitude?
Well, let's see here. What challenges? Well, I think the challenges have always been there. There's always kind of resistance to this, but I think that, and I remember we had a really vibrant discussion about this last summer, right? What happens when there's only so many people who want to be a part of this, right? And you have so many that don't want to be participants in this, or they're just reluctant to join. And I think that, the lesson we can learn from history, and specifically from the civil rights movement, and other movements, abolition movement for that matter, is that, as long as there's a strong kind of cohesive and committed group that's willing to do it, it's amazing how much progress can be done. It's amazing how much kind of the ball can start rolling just from that group. And once it begins to grow in popularity, then all of a sudden it snowballs, right? So, I think, when you look at polling data from the 1960s in response to attitudes towards Martin Luther King or attitudes towards the civil rights movement, it's actually pretty split. It's about 50-50. But, as that struggle went on, more and more people saw themselves as part of the movement from outside and joined it, to the point now where I think that, it's hard to find people who were living in that era who say they weren't part at these movements. You know what I mean? So I think that that's something to think in mind. I think another experience that you can think about is the Iraq War, right? That was another kind of 50-50 split. And, the first couple of years of the Iraq War, I think that public opinion didn't really move that much. But, all of a sudden there's a certain threshold that's reached, and all of a sudden, people start going and beginning to kind of recognize that this is a flawed strategy, or this is a failed policy, right? But it started with that group that was very committed, that was in the streets, that was, getting a protest, licenses, that was, creating different social media accounts, that was doing stuff on the internet, I should say. Really, this was kind of before even social media. But it takes that to kind of get it going. So
for the sake of time, we'll see if there's another question.
If I could ask a question, first of all, thank you again for a fantastic talk. I love your concept, the hierarchy of suffering. And my question is, when we look at white grievance, what I'll call right now, white grievance in terms of post-Reagan deconstruction of the American union system, the stagnant nature of middle-class wages. As we move to make the kinds of moves you discussed at the end of your talk, are we going to have to talk about, I would argue, the stories that have been told by the wealthy about why the American middle class is not where it was during prior to the 80s with the union system. In other words, we know why the union systems aren't here anymore. The wealthy made it happen. At the same time, the phenomenology of the middle class is that it was the immigrants that did this to us. And you've got Trump, who capitalized on that, created massive others, said we need to build a wall. So I'm wondering, as we try to move to the reparations portion of the talk you gave, do you feel that in order to address the hierarchy of suffering and to move white America into a space to talk about reparations, that we may also need to discuss what's been done to them economically in the past 50 years? Now, I'm not saying a should on that. I'm just wondering, if we're going to start with this hierarchy of suffering, how do we address what middle class whites might call their suffering? And do you feel we need to deal with it in order to move on to the issue of reparations? And I'll stop there.
I'll do a real short response, no, but I'll
Yeah.
Well, I would actually disagree. I would say yes. I think that's a really great question, Dr. Jordan, because I mean, the problem here is if you don't, then you're not going to, the legitimacy for it all kind of falls. And I think a good example is to compare what's happened in Europe, right? So, I mean, a lot of the programs that we were calling for at the end is, I guess, we'll create more of a social democratic system than what we have. And, you know, if you think about what happened when the social democratic systems were put into Europe, what happens here is they have their own kind of hierarchy of suffering. So those who were sort of considered citizens, who were in that culture of belonging, part of that national imaginary, they see themselves as distinctively unique and privileged relatives to immigrants that come into these countries, right? And so we've seen that in Brexit. We also see this in Le Pen, right, in France. So I think that, you know, as much as possible, we have to try to create correctives that are universal, right? Which is what we found the baby bonds proposal to be interesting. There needs to be, as much as possible, kind of a universal approach, but we have to tailor these universal approaches so that they do actually account for the disproportionate suffering that communities of trauma, like, you know, for instance, African Americans have dealt with, right? That can be factored in. We have to do both at the same time.
There's some other hands up, so I'll
Thank you.
Anything else?
Yep, I see Tina's been waiting.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to ask about the internment camps. Dr. Craig, I was not aware that African Americans were required to go to internment camps. You mentioned that in order to leave the internment camp, somebody had to vouch for them, a white person had to vouch for them. And it was often their employers. Once they left, were they then free to go find a place to live, or were they having to go back and forth between the internment camp and their jobs?
Yeah, so they were able to leave. Thank you for the question, Doctor. They were able to leave the camps once someone vouched for them and they signed. After they left the camps, and you're right. This is just something I stumbled across, was this notion of these internment camps, right? That they were placed in, and the reasoning was it was to protect them, right? But while they were in the camps, they were still looting their stores and getting their jewelry and the women's furs and all their valuables were taken, right? And never recovered. But they were able to, once they left, they were able to leave. Some Greenwood residents stayed, and you know, Greenwood was rebuilt after the massacre. So they rebuilt it, but of course we know the history of what happened after that, right? Whites moved in again and found other ways, nonviolent acts of taking that property away, right? The latest one is building that highway through Greenwood, right? So splitting Greenwood, but yeah, they were able to leave the camps, and some people report staying in in the camps from 6 to 8 weeks, right? So yeah, and there were 3 areas. A city center, I forget the third one, but that's where they were housed. So and remember also, you know, 10,000 people were homeless, so they really had nowhere else to go anyway. But they were marched into the internment camps, right? It wasn't a free will. They were marched by that National Guard into internment camps. So yeah, so they were able to leave, but Also, some people left, like Stanford and Gurley, they both left Greenwood. One to Chicago, I can't remember, Los Angeles and Chicago. Neither of them were able to rebuild their wealth in those places. Right? So that was the great tragic loss. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Doc. I think Katie.
Yep.
Thank you so much. This is brilliant. I really appreciate it. So I want to follow up on the reparations question that Dr. Jordan had. I do think reparations are really important, but I also worry that they're not enough because we know that, well-educated, wealthy Black people are still very much discriminated against. Cornel West talks about not being able to get a taxi, and, the story of Henry Louis Gates trying to get into his own home, being accused of breaking in. And so unfortunately, anti-Blackness racism still exists even with wealth. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about reconciliation and how that might work, and whether or not you think that we need that locally and nationally. I love that you mentioned Brian Stevenson's work, and that he's collecting soil from places where lynching happened, and creating this museum. And just kind of the question of this national reconciliation, but also how might those stories be told locally? So I guess that was two questions, like what else is needed besides from reparation, and do we need local and national retelling and reclaiming of the stories?
Thank you for that question. And yeah, you're right. I mean, actually, one of the places where Stevenson collected soils from my hometown of Sandusky, Ohio, and I think my brother's on here, but we never knew that there was a lynching in Sandusky, Ohio, right? And everyone knows Sandusky for Cedar Point. There was an actual lynching there. A mob came and pulled a Black man out of the jail there and dragged him through our downtown area, and he was lynched there. So, I think it's also, and the reason we like Brian Stevens so much is that he also talks about social justice, right? That's a big part of his work. It is not just the reparations or the reconciliation, it's the notion of social justice as well, right? How do we recognize these things, and then what do we do about it, right? And which talks to, speaks to his work of incarceration, right? And working on getting some of these people out of the prisons who have been falsely imprisoned, right? And have been incarcerated unfairly for all these years. So it also comes down to that notion of social justice, but also recognizing where these things have happened, because we don't know all the stories yet, right? With that map we put up about all the different areas where these massacres happened, that there probably were more than that, right? And I think it has to be about this notion of social justice, but it also, I think this is a great question. It also comes to this notion of, if you watch some of the documentaries and you listen to some of the stories, this grappling of that Black people have with grappling about this history, right? And this, kind of not wanting to talk about it. And I think that's because of the trauma that's happened from it, right? In this fear of talking about it, for the fear that it might happen again, or that, people talk about, this notion of, we didn't talk about it then because we were afraid to talk about it. We didn't want this violence to come about again, right? And so I think there has to be, the reconciliation, I think has to happen, but it also has to be the social justice, but it also has to be this, this ability to have these narratives, right? To start understanding the power of the narrative also, and getting these stories out, because they're trying to undig these stories also, unearth these stories, these interviews with these survivors, right? And talking to these people. And I think those are the types of things that we have to really start doing. But Steve, do you want to address?
No,
I have a question. Yeah, but I think, I think you're right, Katie. I think it's the reparations, I think, are necessary, because you think about the loss of wealth that these families lost, and not just Tulsa, but all the places where the Red Summer happened, right? That we still haven't talked about. Elaine, Arkansas is probably going to be the next one that we really start thinking about with what happened to them. But this, unearthing all these events that happened, right? And then trying to really understand them and to try to find these stories, and where they happen. So, yeah. But I think you're right. It's beyond just the reparations. It's also, reconciliation, but also social justice for these places.
Thank you so much.
And there's a question from Dr. Tora Morn.
Uh-oh.
Hello. Fantastic presentation this evening. I'm sorry I am not going to show my face because I am getting my house painted, and so my background is actually a mess. And so I think, I think it's historic to be having this conversation today. I think that you allow us to reflect upon the 100th commemoration of this event, and your work is dense, it's theoretical, it's very interesting. But I want to kind of push you a little bit on that question about the democratic response to cultural trauma. And I want to go back to some of the earlier slides that you had about sort of, I don't know if I read it incorrectly, about placing the state as a site where some of these claims can be made. And I am troubled by that. I am troubled by that because the neoliberal state, as it is presently constituted, is perhaps one of the worst places that anyone can come with claims about justice. The neoliberal state has, abdicated its role as a provider of public goods, as a space for doing policy. And so I wonder, are there other places, or are there other institutions that are better suited to address the political claims, the social justice claims that come from this collective trauma? I find the state to be a troublesome institution to address some of these things. And so maybe is the judiciary maybe another, a place where maybe this can be addressed? Or do we have to maybe go outside of the bounds of the US state to be able to address these things in maybe an international court? Or do we need to invent an institution that will really allow the complexity of these claims to be heard without the historical legacy that a state institution brings to the conversation, right? The state was the first institution that disenfranchised African Americans. The state was the first institution that encoded them as property, right? And so I'm very suspicious of the state as a place to put all of these claims, given the history that we have in the last, 250 years. And I know this is a heavy duty question to ask at 8:44 in the evening.
No, thank you for the question. So I guess the first answer would be, we would recommend you look at the book Democracy Against the State, right? Or Democracy in What State? So the tradition of democratic theory that we're working from is one that actually draws a distinction between the idea of democracy and what I think you're referring to as political democracy, which is understanding democracy very much as a specific kind of state form. And so you can see this dichotomy throughout democratic theory. You see it in Karl Marx, the early writings of Karl Marx. You see it in John Dewey. You see it in Derrida. You see it in a number of different theorists, Sheldon Wolin, where there's a distinction between what we call political democracy, which takes a state form, and the idea of democracy. And for us, we want the relationship between trauma to be associated with the idea of democracy. And so I think you're making a very compelling point. It would be interesting to think about maybe kind of institutions beyond the state. But I think the problem here is I think that the best example would be to look at, say, like what happened after World War II. The only way that you were able to actually have a kind of extra state institution do the Nuremberg trials, right, is because the regime that was fighting the Nazi regime was destroyed, right? And you had a transfer of power. The problem that we're dealing with in the United States, and Brian Stevenson actually makes this point, is that, you know, we never actually had a transfer of power after the Civil War. The people who owned slaves stayed in power, right? And then they ended up winning the narrative in their own way after that, because then they basically kind of developed their own narrative about their own innocence, which they propagated through their own schools, and it informs their identity today. Right. I mean, that's kind of the roots of this grievance politics. Right. And so I think we both share your skepticism of the state. We certainly share your skepticism of neoliberalism. I mean, honestly, I think one of the things that's interesting about this particular era with COVID and the financial crisis being conjoined together, these two major crises, is that it's going to inevitably change the state in some way. Right. And so it's possible that the kind of neoliberal arrangement that we've come to kind of take as sort of normal for the last 40 to 50 years may be rupturing, honestly. This is a moment for that to occur. Now, again, there's still maybe a neoliberal of the self, right? That's a different question. But the state formation itself could be changed. And I think that one of the things that becomes compelling about making a claim on the state is that, you know, if we can make trauma be recognized by the state, it fundamentally changes the state, right? You know, one of the things we saw after World War I the growth of the social welfare state in the West begins after World War I, mainly when people when soldiers coming from the battlefields made demands on the state for their repair because they were injured in service of the state, right? So I think that trauma becomes an interesting kind of discursive means to challenge the judiciary, to bring to bear on the state in ways that could fundamentally change it. I share your skepticism, but I also do think that there's more of an opportunity here as well. And if we go international, that requires states to participate. You know, there's states that don't recognize The Hague. I mean, think about China, think about others. You know, they don't care about human rights. That's a universal they don't accept. So I think that there's also risks going that way as well. But I think you make a good point, though.
Great, thank you.
I like the creativity
Absolutely.
of your question, right? That makes us think that we have to start thinking outside that box, possibly. If things don't happen as Dr. Rahko might like to see them happen, right? Then what do we do after that? I think this is where this kind of creativity that I forget who I was talking to about this one day, where that comes into play then, right? What else can we do, right? And yeah, these you know, creating these new institutions, right? Including the university, right? Because that's also this institution. And I agree with you. The problem is the institution, right? And how the institution was founded and who was never included in the institution. So if things don't happen, and I would like to see things happen like Dr. Rahko talked about, but then we have to start getting creative. And that, I think that creates a whole set of challenges, but you know, it's a challenge. That's where we are.
Thank you for your answer. Fantastic.
Thank you for that question, Doc.
So what I don't want to do is end the conversation right now. What I do want to do is take a moment to thank Dr. Craig and Dr. Rahko for their fantastic presentation collectively, if we could. I also want to take a moment to thank all of those who worked behind the scenes to make this evening possible, all those who worked behind the scenes to make the whole series possible, anyone who spoke in the series over the past 3 years that led us to this moment. This has all led to now, and I'm very much appreciative of everyone's efforts. So on that note, please stick around. I don't want to ask Drs. Craig and Rahko to stay all night. I will let them say when they've had enough, but I also do want to allow those who need to leave, of course, to leave, and we'll continue the conversation. So thank you for being here, and we'll continue the conversation.
Yeah, we're fine. I just turned 39 yesterday, so I'm all-nighter.
So Nathan is still more than willing to take any questions anyone might have.
I did have one more question, and could certainly look this up, but I'm interested in what kind of work is being done on assessing the economic impact. You know, you mentioned that, you know, those business owners and entrepreneurs left and were never able to reestablish that type of success. Do we know, or is anybody working on that or estimating that?
That's a good question. Do you mean specifically with regard to Tulsa?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, honestly, the best place to start. So Dr. Craig mentioned Hannibal Johnson as kind of this is the main. So there's been a number of documentaries that have aired. One was on CNN, one was on MSNBC, and he was kind of the chief source for a lot of, I think, the research. He published a book in 1998 called Black Wall Street. And in 1999, there was a commission that was created in Tulsa to begin to do the work of interviewing survivors and to try to document what had happened. And video footage, like camcorder footage of their interviews, has been featured in these documentaries that have been aired the last 2 nights. But to answer your question, you know, the best place to start is probably the Tulsa Commission that was created to begin to recognize the centennial event that occurred today, and to begin to look at like what resources they've been doing. Because I know that in 2015 or 2016, the state of Oklahoma created it, the commission, and financed it. And then they've been doing different kinds of events since 2017, and it's been culminating in the event that occurred today. And of course, there's controversy about this because people pulled out, and it's still a little unclear about what happened.
They weren't.
You can explain. Yeah,
They were not sharing the money, right? And that was one of the big complaints, is that, you know, one of the complaints is about the loss of generational wealth. And so a lot of people, excuse the term, feel like they were pimping the Black folk of the Greenwood district, right?
Yeah. Roland Martin used that term.
Yeah. Roland Martin used the term, so I'll use it. Uncle Ro used it, so I'm gonna use it. But yeah, and not giving these people their due. And so they had this commission, but you know, the question is, what work are you doing? You're building a museum, but you're still not doing anything to save the community, because right now the community is struggling.
And one of the things that has occurred from this has been there's been a very strong call for reparations out of this centennial event, and I think that it's going to be interesting to see who is involved with doing the research to begin to document and then to begin to assess the value lost and for repair.
Yeah.
And that's actually something we're going to be probably looking into as we continue with this. So it'd be great to collaborate, honestly, to figure out like who's doing this work and then to begin to kind of do that. So.
And she's the one to collaborate with.
Well, I was just thinking that even if you started with the wealth that they had at that time, and the growth that they had at that time, if they never did anything else, right? If they just maintained the status quo, that would give you an idea of what that value would be today.
Yeah.
Right.
And Terrence Crutcher's twin sister, Dr. Crutcher's, actually is looking. She actually has done some talking about this is how much that money would be worth today, right? And I mentioned one of those with forgetting the name, with Gurley, with right, the wealth would be now, right? And also with Stratford, you know, and now, again, both of them left Tulsa, left Greenwood, but you know, with Stratford, with the hotel, I mean, it's no, we can't even imagine where that could be now, right, had that property not had that hotel not been burned down, or the rest of the properties that they own, right? Any of those stores that were in that area. But I think it's really a great thing to think about is, are we looking into that loss in wealth and what that could be now, right? And not just in Tulsa, right? Because remember, there were all these other Black communities that were burned down, right? So there's a huge loss of wealth in the Black community because of these, the Red Summer and these other massacres through white supremacy.
Well, and all the more reason why we need HR 40, right? That's why we need the actual commission financed by Congress, because once that act, if that act is passed, then all of a sudden you're getting all the kind of resources of the federal government, National Bureau of Economic Statistics, you're getting the Federal Reserve, you're getting all these kinds of resources that can go in and comb through the data and then actually begin to offer answers to these kinds of questions. And then from there, we begin to figure out what is the just response, what is that democratic response as we're putting it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Williams. So as moderator, I don't always get to ask questions, and this is something that we had on our back channel as we were thinking about some of these issues. And one of the themes that comes out of this conversation and this topic area is that difference between individual and collective. And one of the voices that we hear, especially in the world that is anti-reparation and anti-critical race theory, however it's being defined, is this notion of personal responsibility. And I'm curious how we re-articulate, or how we tactically respond to that notion and press for, again, a more collective, sustained, and I guess, again, you've used the phrase democratic, but I suppose what are some of the more tactical responses that we can have to that kind of phrase, or that rhetoric that's been emerging for a long time?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think it's possible, Dr. Carpenter, that one of the reasons, obviously the easy answer is to say, and these people that you're referring to will say it, is that, we've always been a country that's been about individual personal responsibility and yada yada. Even though a lot of this wealth has been subsidized by the state in so many ways, right? Whether it's R&D from basic research that's been publicly financed, right? Or think about like stadiums that are created that are publicly financed, right? Or bailouts for that matter. There's all sorts of ways in which the narrative doesn't fit any kind of empirical history that actually comes to bear on it. But I think it's also possible that one of the reasons why this narrative of individual responsibility becomes so popular is because we don't actually tell the history of these events. And so it becomes very easy then to create kind of scapegoats that stand in for these actual collective moments of violence and these horrific episodes of trauma that all people are kind of participating in, and they kind of deny that they're participating in it. Do you know what I mean? Or they deny there any relationship to it, which is why at the end, we argue that, again, as a white person, right, we at the very least have secondary or tertiary kind of complicity in this, even if we didn't have, ancestors that owned slaves, right? We are complicit in this in some way, which is why we have to kind of tell the story that way. And so, I think the more that we tell these stories, the more that we understand, the more that we kind of grapple with as a public, the harder it is to actually look away at the collective responsibility. And I think kind of opportunity. And that's the optimist in me coming up with this. I don't know if you share my optimism, but what do you think?
Well, I just think that rhetoric has been around for so long that it's going to be so difficult to to get rid of it. I mean, and no offense here, but it's kind of the white person's go-to. You know, you got to be responsible. You know, why can't those people be responsible? I mean, we have been dogged by that for so long, right? And I don't think, you know, I think especially coming out of this era of this Trump era, that became, you know, I think that type of thinking became popular again. And not that it never lost its popularity, but, you know, I think white folk feel more free to say that now, right? And do that. So I think it's going to stick around for a long time again. But, you know, for me, I guess I just never, I know that exists, but I also know that there's power in all this work that we're doing and how we're, you know, beginning to look at and think about the racial violence that has happened, right? And I think the more that we keep bringing that up and the more of these cases that we start looking at and examining and studying and bringing to the forefront and demanding this justice from these injustices that were done, I think that, you know, I don't think that rhetoric is ever going to disappear, but I think it's going to take a back seat.
Well, yeah, it'll never disappear. The question is whether it remains hegemonic.
Yeah.
Right? That's the real question.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's always going to be there. It's always going to be sort of a, Williams had the argument so many years ago, right? Raymond Williams, that you have the emerging, you have the residual, you have the hegemonic, right? You have the dominant. So this will always be residual, no matter what. Yeah. The question is if this kind of emergent kind of consciousness, I guess if you could call it that, this emerging narrative begins to, you know, supplant that. That's the real question. Yeah. And I think it really could. I really honestly think so. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm just naive. I'm just Pollyannish. But there does seem to be a shift that I've never seen before. And I guess I'm not that old, right? He's younger than me, though. But but the point is, I do think that there has been a shift. And again, it remains to be seen. So
I think Kate.
Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, so this is such a good conversation. So thank you so much. I'm still thinking about social justice and reparations. And I'm thinking also about pain and the way it seems that our society has come to expect that Black people should suffer pain, but yet we know that when people go to the doctor, like Black women are more likely to die in childbirth and they are not given enough medication for pain. Their pain is discounted. And so I'm still like, no amount of money, I don't think is going to change that, because we know studies show people, you know, who are wealthy who go to the doctor, you know, are still having this issue and then at the same time, I feel like our society rewards numbing as long as people aren't taking drugs for the numbing. So I'm not really sure where I'm going with this. Aside from that, you know, I just feel like there's still that justice piece that needs to be changed, because even with the reparations, there's this part of pain, and also thinking about who can tolerate pain. I guess it's this dehumanization that I think has happened, and how do we change that?
Yeah, and I think I'm still with you on that question, because this is where we have to start getting into institutional change, right? It's like Dr. Moratorium was talking about, right? We have to be inventive and creative now and start thinking about, you know, these institutions, hospitals, right? Banking, right? All these institutions that were created that purposely didn't want to, that used, you know, medicine used Black bodies for experimentation, right? So, you know, it's going to have to be a total, I think, deconstruction and then recreating institutions that for so long have treated, you know, the Black body in these, you know, horrific ways, or have not even included the Black body in its, you know, founding principles. And I think when you're on those operating foundations, those origins, those things have to be, I think really taken apart, and then looked at and figured out why. One of my best friends is a physician, and some of the things that she tells me about, some of the even younger white doctors coming in who just get so confused, they don't understand, but they still think, well, the Black body can take more pain. I mean, in 2021, right? Come on. And so that has to do with the teaching in the institution, in the medical school. So, these are people, so I think we have to really challenge the institution as well. And I think that's where it's really funny. I can't get into the language in this email back and forth that I'm having with someone that asked me to do a training session here, but one of the responses when I said, well, I could do a training session on this. Then they said, well, that's not the audience because we have no, this audience is not going to be one that can challenge policy at the university. I'm like, no, everyone can challenge a policy at the university. And so we're having this back and forth about what do I talk about to this audience? And, I'm just about at the point where I'm be like, I'm just not going to do it because you don't understand, what you're saying here in these emails. So I don't know, but I agree with you. I think it's social justice, but social justice on the level where you have to challenge institutional policy as well, right? And not only the policy, but the history of the institution and what those policies, what the foundations of those policies are. So, but also, Katie, I know your work. It really relies on the people who started these institutions, mostly white folk, to say, here's where we screwed up with creating these policies, right? And going back and being honest about that. The same way and being honest about what did we do to these towns and these people? We murdered these people. We took away their wealth. So, it also comes back to that, I'm funny about the word reckoning, but, this acknowledgement of what has been done, to certain groups of people, right? It's not just Black folk, right? It's other people also in this country who have been wronged. But yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And sorry, we went on we talked for a long time, so it kind of, we feel bad with keeping everyone for your Q&A, but, we just had a lot to say. And, Dr. Jordan just kind of gives us a license to go on. He's a good old man over there. That's right. There you go, brother.
Well, to be honest, it's more than just a talk, right? I mean, we targeted the whole series to end tonight, and Memorial Day was yesterday, and that was one kind of recognition of death and trauma. And this is another event where we're recognizing death and trauma and loss. And there's a certain sacredness that comes to it, I'd argue. So when people want to stay, it's also kind of, dare I say, a group mourning, right? And just being around kindred spirits at a time like this is helpful. So if we do stay around too much longer, I may have to go get a beer and take off my tie. But we're going to ask Nathan to cut the YouTube feed and stop recording.
but you're making a good point also, Scott. Dr. Jordan, is that we again, the more research we did into this and into Tulsa and reading about it, and then thinking about all the other horrific events, right, that have happened in this country, and specifically around Red Summer, it's such a loss of life and property and promise, in such a mean-spirited way. It's frightening, and connecting it to now, to look at these events so we can really start thinking about policies that are affecting Black folk and other people in other communities that are struggling. Right. This is why I like the Poor People's Campaign so much. The Reverend is really thinking about and really empowering poor folk to be able to tell their stories and to talk about what their demands are, and I've been to some of the trainings. Steve and I both have been to some of the trainings, and the work that they do to get these people to be able to create their narrative, tell their story, and then demand change is really empowering, right? And all this to me is, hearing these people's stories I'm like, how are these folks still surviving, right? When you think about some of the things that they are having to live through, right? And then when you think back at, Red Summer and the racial violence that these folks lived through, it is very, even if you're not a descendant, it's very traumatizing, I think, it should be traumatizing to everyone, right? But, as far as Greenwood is concerned, my pastor that I grew up with, his wife is a descendant of Greenwood, right? And she's still alive, and so she knows the stories. After the violence, her family chose to leave Tulsa, and they moved to Muskogee, I think is where they moved to, in Oklahoma. But her grandparents, were part of that. So it's still very much real. And of course, we had our 3 survivors at the hearings. So these are very things that are still, excuse me, turning 39 yesterday has me yawning. Are things that are still very relevant and still very they're still here. My brother Bob is doing all this research into our family and some of the things he's finding out, right? And I joked with Roth, I think Roth left the other day, that, hey, we need to talk, we might be related, with Roth Smith, who's in the School of Comm, because we're realizing that we have, my father's family is from the same area that he's from. And we know that, we're finding out the families, the names of the plantation owners that were, that had my father's family. So, and then to go all the way to Sandusky, the town where I'm from, and to hear about this lynching, but then some other things that we're discovering that will become another project that I won't talk about on here, but some of the things that happened to Black folk there, right? So, it's, and this is in our lifetime. So, it's a mourning time, but it's also a time for this awakening and really examining, where I think we each can go to our own homes and find these stories that exist, right? These very real stories that happen to people in our own communities, and who probably still have descendants who are still living and remember some of these things, but for some reason won't talk about it. But I think a lot of these stories are out there, and I think this should be the era where we start digging into our own hometowns and getting these stories and talking about this injustice that's been done. And like you said, Katie, this really thinking about these reparations and this social justice and how that could look. If all these stories come out, what would that look like, as far as social justice? Because when so many stories come out, and you have to stop denying this fact. Well, you can do better. It's up to you to do better, right? No, you put us in these positions. So you do better.
Well said.
Maybe that's the trick here, right? Is to turn that "you can do better" around, point that finger, no, you could do better, right? And
That's
so
the title of the next talk. You can do better.
Yeah.
So let's do this. Let's bring the event to an official close, so that Nathan can close down the YouTube channel. And we invite all of you who still want to continue to talk. We're going to cut the recording so we don't have to worry about what we're saying. So thanks to everyone again for coming. Thanks to Byron and Stephen for giving an amazing talk tonight. And yeah, have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone on YouTube.